Member for York Simcoe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to be able to offer a few minutes looking at the Bill 10, the Child Care Modernization Act. One of the things that I think needs to be understood at the very outset of this is whether this is actually not one step forward, two steps back. Because when we look at the details of the, quote, Modernization Act, it seems to me that it has thrown many thousands of people into a deep concern over the direction that this act takes the government. It seems in their minds that, in fact, this is an insistence by this government on making life more difficult for Ontario families and a fundamental removal of choice when it comes to childcare. So it's in that context, then, that I look at this particular piece of legislation. The bill purports to update childcare in the province, and I think it's also important to understand the nature of the legislation that governs and the categories of childcare that is provided in this province. Today we have three different categories. Private in-home daycares, which have fewer than 5 or fewer children. They, however, if there's more than one location, the centre becomes a private home care daycare agency that must be licensed under current legislation. And finally, we have day nurseries, which have more than 5 children and must be licensed as well. Those would be the ones that most of us recognize as either for-profit or not-for-profit. They're standalone, or they're part of schools or leisure centres or something like that. But the important thing is that 80% of children are in unlicensed daycares, private home daycares. And it's important to understand that there is a demand for these facilities, the vast majority of which, of course, provide safe care for infants and toddlers. Thousands of families are happy with the care they receive and oftentimes save money by not sending their children to potentially more expensive licensed care. Unlicensed home daycares play an important role in our province. I know several people who have opted for this type of care. Sometimes it's the only care available to families with young infants, as many licensed centres will only take children 18 months or older. Unlicensed homes can fill that gap between 12 to 18 months when families are desperate for care as parents go back to work after a 12-month maternity leave. So it's really important to understand that they have a very specific role, that they cover about 80% of the people that are seeking daycare. On October the 20th, the Minister of Education in question period implied that unlicensed childcare centres are illegal. There seems to be some confusion about the difference between being unlicensed and actually illegal. In Ontario, the Ministry of Education's own website, quote, "In Ontario, individuals may look after 5 or fewer children under 10 years of age without a license in addition to their own children if in their own home." So I think that we must make it clear for the public that unlicensed doesn't mean illegal. But there's also something that we need to understand, and that is the fact that, particularly on the heels of the publication of the Ombudsman report, very clearly a history of poor administration on the part of the government. So it's important to understand that even before this piece of legislation, there was already a complaint system in effect for daycare. If someone suspected wrongdoing or danger, an inspector is supposed to investigate the child care facility in a timely manner. manner. But the Ombudsman report released last week tells a very different story, a story of failure on the part of the government. Careless about childcare is the title, and I think it speaks for itself. His report on childcare consists of 113 recommendations, and the details of the kind of problems that the Ombudsman reports demonstrates that the government has not been following its own rules. Surely we recognize there are standards in place, there is already legislation, but we have to follow the legislation and guidelines that exist as opposed to creating a whole new system to deal with potential problems. The Ombudsman identifies this in his report. Point 1, sloppy, inconsistent complaint intake practices and an inadequate complaint tracking system. 2, ministry guidelines not followed, inspections delayed or never done. Staff untrained in conducting investigations or on legislation they enforce. Poor inspection practices, careless evidence gathering, and failure to involve or educate parents about daycare standards and facilities that are not in compliance with them. These are some of the details that the Ombudsman report deals with, and he refers to it as, quote, a legacy of dysfunction by this government. And the fact that for all of us, the disturbing information that government officials ignored numerous complaints shows that this government was failing to protect children. As I said, there is already a system in place. It was not being used. I suggest that we first look at the legislation that is in place and look at what we should be doing. The government is unfairly attempting to change the rules for families with young children. Bill 10 will in effect destroy the child care system that is currently in place and make it difficult for these centres to continue to operate. It also threatens the livelihood of thousands of people and causing unnecessary chaos for families needing to find care. But Bill 10 does not provide any solutions that will ensure when thousands of daycare spaces close, there will be a vast shortage of licensed centres. Where will children go when their unlicensed centres close? Where is the government's plan for the 80% of Ontario's children that will be forced out? And of course, in turn, will families find themselves having to look at giving up a job in order to look after their children? Increasing government regulation, according to this proposed piece of legislation, and oversight in existing centres will also mean that childcare costs will inevitably soar in order to fund the growing bureaucracy, licensing costs, and increased inspections. There are currently thousands of children in unlicensed care. Who will be able to perform those inspections? What infrastructure is in place, or will we need to create a new system from scratch? We know that even with the current system, it can take time to have an inspection done. It seems that having more inspectors at a greater cost would be the only way to make Bill 10 work. If that's the case, then we're going to be spending more on childcare while actually providing less childcare. We're spending more on inspectors and the whole infrastructure of a childcare bureaucracy without actually increasing the number of spaces. If there's extra money in the childcare fund, then we should be reducing the cost for families. Ontario families are already struggling to have a two-income household and provide adequate childcare for their children. Ontario has the highest childcare costs in Canada. According to a 2013 Globe and Mail report, a study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development indicates the monthly average cost for infants in Ontario is $1,100. That's an annual cost of $13,000. You can think of this as a second mortgage. Childcare costs are already extremely high, especially compared to other provinces. Manitoba's, for instance, is $631. Creating more red tape, more regulations, and increased operating costs for Ontario centres in Ontario will only make it more difficult on the books of families and business. Mr. Speaker, in the last 5 years, I've spoken with hundreds of small businesses over that time and have heard the horror stories about regulations and red tape. Some businesses have said that they can't keep up with the regulations and costs that it takes to be a small business in Ontario. Some businesses, depending on the industry, must deal with a plethora of agencies, boards, and commissions and meet requirements from all of them. And sometimes the requirements for one are in competition with another. I used this example the other day when discussing Bill 18, but I think it's a great example. In 2012, the Ontario Home Builders Association said there were 28 ABCs, agencies, boards, and commissions, that home builders have to deal with. How much time businesses have to deal with all of these ABCs and all the different rules they make? Why is the government making it so difficult for businesses in Ontario to succeed? If Bill 10 passes, pretty soon a whole new industry, childcare centres, will learn how hard it is to deal with more and more government bureaucracy. Who knows how many of these centres will be closed due to the increased red tape, regulation, and associated costs. Not only is business hit with red tape, but they also have to worry about payroll taxes, which Bill 10 is sure to add to child care centres if passed. The Ontario Retirement Pension Plan is the most recent payroll tax that the government will be introducing. According to businesses and associations that I have spoken to, the ORPP will inevitably add more expense, reduce profits, and jobs will be lost. Between red tape, regulations, and payroll taxes, the government seems to be on the lookout for ways to make running a business in this province more difficult, and I'm struggling to understand why this is. Bill 10 is going to create another bloated bureaucracy. The problem is that this is looking after something that could have been looked after by the regulations that already exist. We look at, even in the College of Trades, the kind of bureaucracy that has been created and the kind of oversight that has been, is part of that bill. So it looks like another industry, childcare centres, are the next in increasing costs for businesses and families. One of the most important things that I think is a potential fallout from the changes that are being contemplated is what this will do for people who can't meet the requirements, see having fewer children as something that they can't manage. They're going to be looking at doing it on the QT. Parents are going to be looking for spaces for their children. People are going to be able to offer this. And I think it will only encourage, when there are such vast numbers of people that are affected, to operate underground. So in fact, once you produce that level of frustration, that level of inability to pay fees and incur the costs, the effect of the bill then is actually to decrease the oversight as more and more seek to provide the service in an underground economy. My colleague from Simcoe North has called on the minister to consult with daycare providers and families on Bill 10 before rushing to pass it. He has suggested that the bill travel during the winter recess so that we can have a better understanding of its impacts. We have received letters already about how the bill will negatively affect daycare providers and families with young children. But it seems that it would be good for the minister to hear these stories firsthand from the people who have to live with the effects of the bill every day. Families and child care providers should be consulted on this bill so that we ensure that any new legislation will help, not hurt families and children. I add my voice to that request because one of the things that is such a dramatic influence on the way in which this bill would be rolled out is whether you are in an urban area or a rural area. Because in much of the rural areas, there aren't standalone daycare centers. There aren't that kind of opportunity for people. And people do look to neighbors and friends and people in the community to provide daycare. And so that unlicensed daycare is an option for people. When it's made more and more difficult for anyone to provide that kind of service, it just reduces the opportunity for people to find that neighbor, that friend, the person who's been doing it in the community for years, no longer able to do so. So I think that apart from the varied voices that come with the process of public hearings, one of the most important voices left out is the small town, where the people may not be able to access large, bigger scale centers. The other thing about this legislation is the question of timing, because obviously this is a whole thousands and thousands of people involved, and they need to have time to make adjustments. The people in the business need to know whether or not they can survive, whether there's a business case for them to be able to survive, and families need time to be able to make those adjustments as well. So I think that timing of this legislation is critical, any kind of implementation planning. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the question of the underground economy is one that I think that should be viewed very, very carefully, because of the fact that when people need to make those kinds of choices and are unable to, they feel they're ready to take maybe a bigger risk than they otherwise would, but they also feel somewhat desperate. And so I think there's a lot of good reason why we need to have the bill travel and hear different points of view. And I think also we need to recognize that no piece of legislation should force families into choices that they would not otherwise make. When it comes to childcare, people deserve a choice. There is no one size that fits all. Some prefer an intimate home setting, which might not work for others. We must continue to offer families options so that they can feel comfortable leaving their children in the care of others. As I said earlier, 80% of children in Ontario today are in those home settings. And I think that it's extremely important to, when we're looking at this bill, to look at the goals of the bill. They should be clear: safe, stimulating, and affordable experience for our most valuable resource, our babies and their futures. Instead, this bill throws out to us the specter of declining spaces and consequent shortages, the increased cost with inspection and bureaucracy, and restricted choice for parents. I think that is the danger of this bill, and I certainly want to indicate that we feel that this takes away from the family's ability to choose what type of daycare best suits their lifestyle. And as the Ombudsman report outlines, the childcare system in Ontario must be fixed, but Bill 10 is not the solution. Thank you.